In today's Gospel, we see Jesus continuing his dialogue with the Jews in the temple. And he makes a very intriguing statement at one point when he says, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to think he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." What does he mean by this? Even the people who he's talking to are confused and don't understand what he's alluding to here. It's almost certain that he's referring back to Genesis chapter 22, where Abraham is about to sacrifice his own son Isaac, and then God calls down at the last minute and says, "No, don't do it." And he actually declares one of the very early messianic prophecies. He says to him, God himself will provide the sacrifice. In actual fact, that is what happens when Jesus comes to earth. Jesus is God in the flesh, and he becomes our sacrifice. But what Abraham is experiencing here is the day of Jesus, if you like. His son, who is about to be sacrificed, is resurrected from the jaws of death. Now, obviously, it's not at all like what Christ will experience, and Christ actually does go to his death and then overcomes death and rises from the grave. But it is, in a way, like the day of Christ. And this is what Christ is pointing to here, that he's really alluding to what's about to come as well. He is about to go and suffer to become the ultimate Passover lamb for our sins. And then he will become the firstborn from the dead. He will be resurrected. He is the sacrifice that God himself will provide, because Christ is God himself, and he will become our sacrifice. The other interesting point for me about today's gospel comes at the very end, when we see Jesus having to hide and then flee from the Jews in the temple because they want to stone him. It's very interesting because here is Jesus in an extremely vulnerable moment, and it can be very easy to think that the vulnerability of Jesus was only really something that affected him when he was a baby. Of course, when he's in Mary's womb and they have to make that arduous journey back to Bethlehem for the census, and then obviously he's born in a stable, and then of course they have to flee into Egypt to escape Herod and his brutal and murderous machinations. And we think, well, that's sort of the end of it. Jesus is now a fully grown man and he's not as vulnerable anymore. But in actual fact, as we see in today's gospel, that vulnerability never ever left Jesus. Today's gospel, with Jesus having to hide, is kind of like a little mini recreation of that flight into Egypt. Jesus is once again having to hide from people who want to kill him. And it's a powerful reminder that Christ was fully human. He was just like us. So if you find yourself in those moments, maybe that's happening for you today, but whenever you find yourself in moments of life where you are just struggling, maybe with persecution or difficulty or suffering, and it just all seems so very hard, always remember that Christ himself has experienced those same sufferings and difficulties. He made himself like one of us. And this moment today where we see him hiding, to me, it really speaks again to Christ's humility. He puts aside his glory and comes to earth to be one of us, and all of the vulnerabilities and frailties that entails. It really is quite a profound act of love, but that profound act of love doesn't end there. That profound act of love becomes even more huge when Christ walks the way of the cross and becomes the perfect lamb of sacrifice for all of our sins. Today's Saint quote of the day comes from Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, and she said this: "Let us go forward in peace, our eyes upon heaven, the only one goal of our labours." This time of Lent should be a time of simplifying and stripping back in order to reflect ever more deeply on that important and profound truth, that we are the people who are called to a home in heaven. As St. Paul says, we are in the world but not of the world. We are strangers and aliens journeying through this life. That doesn't mean that we're disconnected from the people around us. Far from it. We are called to take Christ into the culture around us. But ultimately, our home is in heaven. And Lent is about stripping back those distractions which often cause us to forget that. The things of this life that become so attractive and so appealing. Because as Jesus reminds us in today's gospel, whoever keeps my word will never see death.